The Demand Illusion: How Artificial Stimulus and Engineered Migration Mask Economic Decay. Introduction. Modern economic metrics, GDP, employment, consumer spending, paint a picture of recovery and resilience. But beneath this surface lies a more fragile reality: a system increasingly dependent on engineered demand. This demand hasn't risen from productive innovation or sustainable population growth. Instead, it has been manufactured through mass immigration pipelines, unchecked fiscal spending, and monetary expansion. These levers create the appearance of vitality, but only mask a deeper economic decay. In this exposition, we examine how artificial demand, particularly through migration and stimulus, has distorted economic signals. We explore how these forces inflated housing markets, boosted consumption, and propped up GDP. But as these inputs wane, cracks emerge: inventory gluts, declining money velocity, and a coming wave of unsustainable deficit spending. This is not a story of growth. It's the story of a mirage engineered to delay reckoning. Section 2. Engineered migration as a demand lever. Net legal immigration into the U.S. typically hovers around 1 million people per year. But between 2021 and 2024, estimates suggest that 10 to 15 million illegal immigrants entered the country, an unprecedented, government-enabled surge, largely facilitated through NGO pipelines and quietly funded by public money. The economic effect was immediate. Each migrant introduced demand for housing, transportation, food, education, and healthcare. Estimates suggest an all-in fiscal impact of $50,000 to $100,000 per person. At 10 million people, that's $0.5 to $1 trillion injected into GDP without a single new product or innovation. It was stimulus, cloaked in humanitarian policy. Critically, this demand was asymmetric. Few of these new entrants worked or contributed taxable income. Estimates show only 2 million of the 10 to 15 million migrants found jobs. The rest were dependent consumers. And consumers they were, spending stimulus-backed funds on essentials, driving demand for shelter, and supporting landlords, retail chains, and service industries across key states like Texas, Florida, and Arizona. But this manufactured demand was always fragile. As policy reversed in late 2024 and early 2025, migration collapsed. Self-deportations began, new border restrictions were implemented. The result? Demand cratered, particularly in rental markets and low-end consumption, creating ripple effects we now trace in economic data. Section 3. Housing as a synthetic economic engine. Housing accounts for roughly 20% of U.S. consumption and is deeply interwoven with GDP. When migration surged, it strained rental markets, driving up prices and triggering a boom in construction, investment, and multi-property ownership. This created the illusion of a housing shortage and a population boom. But the underlying demand wasn't stable. By Q4 2024, with immigration policy tightening, new tenant rents began falling. Inventories in cities like Phoenix, Tampa, and Austin hit multi-year highs. The marginal renter, often an undocumented migrant, was no longer in the system. This exposed the fragile foundation of the post-2020 housing surge. Builders overbuilt, investors overleveraged. Housing demand didn't collapse because of economic weakness. It collapsed because the illusion of demand was removed. And in a margin-driven system, that was enough to tip the scales. This content is brought to you by Bobby Gigs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 4. The Monetary Mismatch: M2 versus Velocity. During this same period, the M2 money supply began to edge upward again. The reason? The Fed quietly tapered quantitative tightening and began plugging holes in the long-term Treasury market, facing tepid demand and rising yields. In effect, more liquidity was being added to the system, not to expand growth, but to paper over fiscal cracks. Yet this newly created money isn't circulating. Velocity of money, the rate at which money changes hands, has begun declining again after a short-lived recovery. Why? Because the most active consumers, e.g. the immigration-driven low-income class, are shrinking, and the remaining population is either saving, deleveraging, or frozen by uncertainty. This divergence, rising M2, falling velocity, is the clearest signal that economic energy is fading. The Fed can increase the quantity of money, but it cannot force transactions, confidence, or productivity. The system is bloated with idle liquidity and no organic engine to mobilize it. Trump's fiscal promises and the debt horizon. Enter the next wave of artificial demand. Trump's proposed One Big Beautiful Bill. It promises massive tax cuts on tips, overtime, Social Security income, alongside regulation rollbacks and increased military spending. According to the CRFB and Peterson Foundation, such a bill could add $7 to $10 trillion to the national debt over the next decade. The question is, how will it be funded? In all likelihood, the same way recent demand was funded, through expanded deficits and quiet monetary accommodation. In other words, more printing. The short-term effect will be another sugar high, more disposable income, a GDP bounce, temporary wage growth, but the structural costs, debt, inflation risk, and trust erosion will continue compounding. This isn't a new economy. It's the same illusion, recycled under a different banner. Section 6, the feedback loop, illusions, indicators, and instability. The real danger is not simply debt or deficit. It's the false sense of security created by artificial demand. GDP growth boosted by immigration-induced consumption, rental markets sustained by short-lived migrant demand, stock markets rising on stimulus expectations. None of these are signs of real prosperity. They are engineered artifacts, built on flows that are either temporary, unsustainable, or both. As these flows reverse, immigration slows, fiscal tightening reappears, and the Fed loses control over inflation expectations, the entire demand engine starts sputtering. And because so many businesses, assets, and political narratives were built on these illusions, the adjustment could be severe. Conclusion. What appears as recovery is, in many ways, a mirage. The U.S. economy has been living off synthetic demand. Whether through mass migration, deficit spending, or monetary distortion, policymakers have substituted optics for substance. Now, as those inputs stall or reverse, we face the consequences: falling velocity, a housing market in retreat, ballooning debt, and a confused population wondering why growth feels so hollow. It's time to recognize the distinction between earned demand and engineered demand before the next illusion takes hold.